Welcome back. Today we present our third lecture on consciousness, or how the brain instantiates and produces consciousness. Now, the history of this goes back quite a few years. In 1985 or so, Patricia Churchland, a philosopher at UC San Diego, wrote a book called Neurophilosophy. I still highly recommend this book, although it's now 30 years old. But she, in a very prescient way, predicted many of the things that we're dealing with now in looking at the brain and how it produces consciousness. In the first slide, we see here a quote that Patricia Churchland gave in an interview with the New Yorker in 2007. And she says, various philosophers today think that science is never going to be able to understand consciousness, she said in her lecture. And one of the most appealing arguments, I don't know why it is appealing, but it seems to be, is, quote, I can't imagine how you could get pain out of meat. I can't imagine how you could get seeing the color blue out of neurons firing. So Dr. Churchland then continues, now, whether you can or cannot imagine certain developments in neuroscience is not an interesting metaphysical fact about the world. It's not a very interesting psychological fact about you. So a very dismissive attitude, of course, and dismissing a wholesale objection in the vein of it's just not possible that a material object such as the brain, obeying the rules of physics, can ever produce consciousness. And as you recall, this is the task we have set for ourselves in this lecture series, to introduce you to approaches that scientists have pursued to do just that. In the next slide, I'll show you a paper that's also available as a clickable item in our presentation page to subscribers of this series. This paper is the foundation paper, really, cited frequently as the original impetus to the neuroscience of consciousness. And it's written by two people we have encountered before, namely Francis Crick, winner of the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the structure of DNA, and Christoph Koch, a neurophysiologist, neuroscientist at Caltech. And so this paper is entitled Towards a Neurobiological Theory of Consciousness, and it was written and published in 1990. So think about that. That is 27 years ago. This is really when things became acceptable, when the research began in looking at consciousness as produced by the brain, as a natural phenomenon, as a neuronal phenomenon. So today we will look at some approaches that have been taken to dissect and interrogate the brain in terms of what is the hallmark, what is the echo, what is the neuronal correlate of a conscious percept as opposed to an image that goes into the brain but is not consciously perceived. So this is then from the paper of Christoph Koch, and he suggested, together with Francis Crick, that one ought to start with the visual system because it's very well characterized and studied. The macaque-monkey system has been extremely well studied, and you see here the classical wiring diagram. As you start from the retina, the impulse flow goes to the lateral geniculus, the superior colliculus, then to the primary visual cortex V1, where initial feature extraction occurs, such as lines and so on, to V2, where further feature extraction is done, and V3, V3A, and here is a connection to the ventral stream. Eventually, we wind up in the visual cortex here, the frontal eye field, and other cortical areas that eventually produce the visual image or integrate the visual image. Here is the inferior temporal cortex. So that was the proposal. Start with a visual system, and that's in fact what has been done. Now, the other event that took place around 1989 was the publication of a book by Bernard Bars. Now, Bernard Bars is a philosopher, and he was just like Patricia Churchland, giving thought to the idea of finding a philosophical neurobiological approach to the issue of consciousness, and he published a book, A Cognitive Theory of Consciousness. And he reviewed this book off and on. Recently, another extension of his book has been published in Amazon Kindle, where it is available for free. You can download his original book as well as his more updated annotations. So here is an incarnation of this book in the theater of the consciousness, the so-called global workspace theory. And he calls it a rigorous scientific theory of consciousness, appearing in a journal dedicated to consciousness studies, the Journal of Consciousness Studies, which has been around now also for about 20 years or slightly more. So this was then a metaphor, and I'll show you the picture here. It's a very apt and productive metaphor of scientific fecundity. It lends itself to exploration of various aspects of consciousness. So here's the proposal. When we become aware of a conscious content, it is like a searchlight in a dark theater illuminating one actor on the stage. Now, this is in the background of a vast, unconscious audience of vast capacity of prior information, knowledge, memory, the so-called priors that we have talked about earlier. So this is a huge set of background information. Now, we need selective attention to fish out from this background the one conscious event that we want to become conscious of. So selective attention then here is thought to control the spotlight that brings out the one conscious content that we want to process. So conscious access is at once extraordinarily open and extraordinarily selective. Its potential repertoire, of course, is vast. We can be conscious of new information, something that we see, something that we hear, a memory, a vast store of memory, information that we have learned, etc., etc. So there is a bottleneck implied here. We cannot at one time bring all the contents of consciousness to the fore, but only one item at a time. It's reminiscent of the working memory that has been shown to accommodate only 5 to 7 items. If you try to remember a 9-digit phone number, you may have some trouble getting the number into your short-term memory immediately. 7 numbers is a lot easier. So there is a bottleneck both in conscious processing and in working memory, and there may be a systematic relationship between the two. Now, the other item that Dr. Bars already predicted is called the minimal contrast. So he suggested to find an echo in the brain, the neuronal correlate of a conscious content, we ought to have 2 stimuli that are very, very similar to each other. There's only a minimal contrast between the two, but only one of them is perceived as conscious content, whereas the other is somewhere in the brain and stuck and preconscious and cannot be accessed, and serves as a control to differentiate that neuronal activity belonging to the non-perceived item versus the perceived item. And that, in fact, is the strategy that has been employed in a huge number of studies, and we will focus on a couple of those today. Many date back a few years, primarily by Dr. Stanislas Dehaene in Paris, France, where he is a member of the French Academy. And one recent paper that just appeared a couple of weeks ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in other words, in the late month of March of 2017. And there is an interesting relationship between the old work and this new one, and we will focus on this development in this presentation. Okay then, so the global workspace theory is an empirical technique that will employ contrastive analysis, the minimal contrast. This has now become a routine approach in neuroscience. So the global workspace is then a functional hub, in a sense, of binding and propagation in a population of loosely coupled signaling elements. The global workspace architecture recruits many distributed specialized agents in the brain to cooperate in resolving focal ambiguities. This is all the language from Dr. Bars. In the brain, conscious experience may reflect a global workspace function, a kind of neuronal cloud computing. So you can tell that this edition here is from his most recent edition of his theory, because cloud computing, of course, was not known in 1989. Now, the conscious content can arise from the cortico-thalamic core, the feedback loop that links the thalamus to the cortex and back, when multiple inputs settle on a winner-take-all equilibrium that is then broadcast throughout the brain. So there should be a widespread integration and broadcasting that suddenly happens to those stimuli which enter conscious awareness. So here then is Dr. Dehaene and his understanding of the global workspace. So you can see here that there are subliminal stimuli that have not made it all the way into the global workspace, or pre-conscious stimuli, but only when a conscious stimulus is strong enough to excite enough neurons, the information is broadcast in a sudden ignition of the global workspace neurons to broadcast this event throughout the brain, so comparison and integrations can be accomplished that produce a conscious awareness of the stimulus. So that is the theory. When this ignition takes place, that is tantamount to the content becoming suddenly conscious. It's an all or none phenomenon, and it predicts a nonlinear event, namely a slow accumulation here in preconscious learning and a sudden nonlinear function, such as this, that would ignite with enough power the global workspace to produce a conscious event. That was the hypothesis, and experiments, in fact, bear this out. So we will approach this line of thinking now in the next few slides here. So why is it that we need this ignited state to produce conscious content? Well, we need global availability of information. That is what is subjectively experienced as the conscious state. Only when enough brain regions agree about the importance of incoming sensory information do they synchronize to such a large extent that the network is triggered. Now, even if you are in full darkness and not experience any visual input, the brain entertains itself and produces ceaselessly global patterns of activity that on occasion will rise to the level of consciousness. The same, of course, is true in the transition from non-REM deep sleep to REM sleep, when suddenly images that belong to your dreams, sounds, pictures that are often quite vivid and lifelike are produced and enter your consciousness. So the brain is not necessarily requiring that sensory information come in to trigger conscious events. It can also produce those events all by itself. This has implications for a theory of so-called Bayesian priors. We will get back to this in a later lecture. All right, so let's clarify some vocabulary. Namely, there is the idea of conscious access versus attention. William James, in the early 1900s, already proposed a famous definition. Attention, he said, is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seem generally simultaneously possible objects or trains of thoughts. Only one. We translate this today into conscious access, seeing this one item out of many, and we have used selective attention to probe this one content, just as you saw in the pictorial metaphor by Dr. Boss, where the searchlight in the darkened theater picks out one actor on the stage. We will also want to differentiate conscious access versus vigilance. Vigilance is being awake. It refers to the level of excitement in the cortical and thalamic networks that support conscious access. So wakefulness, vigilance, and attention are enabling conditions for conscious access. Let me show you in the next slide what vigilance is all about. So here on the x-axis we plot vigilance. And you can see that even in vegetative states you can have vigilance, but no conscious content. You need two things. You need the apparatus to create conscious content and vigilance both to have a conscious waking experience. And over here is REM sleep, so it's a little lower on the vigilance scale because you are, after all, sleeping, but there is enough cortical arousal to allow the brain to create, edit, and produce the movies that be perceived as dreams. Now, in general anesthesia or coma, vigilance is very low and consciousness, of course, is no longer possible. Interestingly, there are conditions such as the parasomnias, in which there is very low conscious content, but there is vigilance going on. This is, of course, an active area of research. Now, visual attention and awareness are different. And let me show you a paper here by a group from Amsterdam that has dealt with this. They have the following model. Visual input comes into the visual cortex, and at this point, the content remains unconscious. This happens in the first 40 milliseconds after the image is produced in the retina. After 60 milliseconds, you have wider spread of the activity into the other cortices, even into the temporal cortex. However, consciousness in this model only arises when you have feedback loops from brain areas towards the feed-forward sleep, the avalanche of information coming in through V1, V2 up to the temporal cortex needs then to be contrasted with information already present in cortical neurons. And it's this interplay of feed-forward sweep and feedback backpropagation and countering the sweep and processing the information, producing something called an error signal and error reduction, that is required for consciousness to occur. This will be presented at a later lecture. We have talked about the Bayesian brain and the era of error minimization and how visual and other sensory processes are handled in the brain. But this is an allusion to this event, that backpropagation and the comparison of the incoming signal with prior information in the brain somehow is necessary for conscious information processing. And here's another way of showing this. Here you have two stimuli coming in at the same time, and you have the unconscious responses occurring in the first 100 to 150 milliseconds. And the conscious response then occurs when you get recurrent interactions that engage with the incoming stimuli A and B. Now, at this point, there is no retinotopic mapping anymore. Working memory may also be involved, and iconic memory stores can now be created from this conscious content. Okay, so top-down amplification is also mentioned by Dehaene. This is the second stage of visual processing. On trials in which stimulus perceived consciously, bottom-up and top-down inputs reinforce each other until a broad network of cerebral areas become ignited versus via long-term distance connections. So this is Dr. Dehaene, and here is a link to a YouTube video. He is quite an interesting lecturer, and I encourage you to view his lecture on his work. He's quite a prominent researcher in the field of how the brain produces consciousness, and his work is almost entirely focused on dissecting in exquisite detail how visual input becomes conscious in the brain. So we have already gone over his global workspace interpretation, and the next slide shows his prediction as to what should happen to a signal that we can detect in the brain in response to conscious versus non-conscious processing. So in subliminal processing, non-conscious, you get an early wave and then a later potential here at 300 to 400 milliseconds, the so-called P300, and even later events. As you approach higher visual areas, you approach conscious content now, and you see that this wave is increasing, and suddenly in the prefrontal areas is a sudden ignition of all or none discharges or integration of cortical areas here in the frontal lobe that are in some way critical for consciousness to appear. So again, we are still in the global workspace model that Dr. Dehaene cites frequently as the inspiration for his work. Now, I mentioned in the last lecture that machine learning or computer algorithms that implement neural networks have become increasingly important in neuroscience. This work that Dr. Dehaene describes has been done mostly with EEG, a multitude of electrodes, maybe 64 or 100 or more electrodes on the scalp, sometimes even intra-brain electrodes. And these signals, of course, are time series that are correlated with each other. So there is a multitude of statistical relationships in time among these electrodes, and no human can dissect these correlations. But what you can do is input these results into a machine that has artificial intelligence, and you can train this machine to detect certain features in the incoming signals and their various relationships to each other in statistical models that allow you to extract features that allow the machine then to predict what has happened in the brain and whether or not a stimulus has been perceived as being conscious or not. So there is a training phase, and you train this machine to develop so-called classifiers. And here you can see there is a training time, and various classifiers are being developed, which then later on in the next set of experiments allow you to decode the EEG signals. So the machine has learned what conscious perceptions look like in the EEG and what non-conscious perceptions look like, and it can make a call even without the experimental subject announcing that he or she has made a conscious percept. The computer, the neural network, can make the prediction. Yes, with this brainwave, you have experienced a conscious percept. And this in fact happens. So here is a typical experiment where the task is to see the number 9. Now the number 9 appears interspersed with so-called masks that show completely unrelated information. And you can vary the time delay between the percept that you want the subject to see and to report that he or she has seen this number 9. You can destroy the perception of the number 9, or you can facilitate the perception of the number 9 and then see what happens in the brain, what is the relationship of the number 9 having been perceived and the topographical brain activity, and what you see is described here. Namely, in the prefrontal cortex, you see the sudden ignition when the percept has been made supra-threshold. So subliminal information here is not perceived. You see these colors here at the bottom, and only as you approach colors of this nature here do you see the percept. And here, of course, is the hot zone, the ignition that occurs in the frontal cortex, signifying that a conscious percept has arrived in the patient's consciousness. So here then is what this magic classifier has to say, the artificial intelligence machine. And it can make the call. You see the more of these colors you see here, this red color, the more certainty is there. The algorithm predicts that a conscious percept has been seen. And you can see there is a time delay where it takes about 100 milliseconds for the subjective report to be made. Yes, I saw the number 9, but the computer already knows, yes, the number 9 has been perceived in the consciousness of the subject. Now, this already happens in young infants. Now, the time delays are somewhat longer, indicating that the system processing this is not quite mature. But here's the setup, of course. You see a forward mask, which is sort of a nonsensical mask that doesn't have any information. Here, of course, is a friendly face. And babies love friendly faces. We do as well. And here is a control trial. So you see either the friendly face or you see this mashup. And then you introduce a backward mask. Doing this after this friendly face was shown will kind of destroy the ability of the infant to perceive the friendly face and respond accordingly. So here's the setup. You see the friendly, excited infant, and the face and the mask, either pre-stimulus or post-stimulus. And here is the linear accumulation of evidence. Over time, we become more and more certain that something is going on. But here then is the all or none ignition in these later time points. And you can see they are a lot more postponed and longer from the stimulus than in the adult, 150 to 250 milliseconds as opposed to 100 to 150, for example. So even at 15, 12, and 5 months of age, infants already show two stages of phase processing. A linear evidence accumulation here, and then a very late nonlinear sudden ignition. Now, the infants don't necessarily talk about that they saw the phase because infants don't talk yet, but you can monitor other reactions such as pupillary size or how intently an infant will gaze at an image that tells you that the percept was conscious. Now, I introduce you now to another modification of this technique, and that is called attentional blink. A very clever technique which exploits the process of a delay. So you have a target here. Target is the letter N. The other target is the letter T. This is what you are supposed to detect. And then you have random numbers interdispersed in your visual field. And you can see if the delay is too short, your chances of seeing the target are significantly reduced. And that is called attentional blink. You can only have so many percepts per time. You need about 100 or more milliseconds to recover from the initial conscious percept to be ready to process a second one. So you're kind of out of commission for a period of time. And you can use the attentional blink period to probe what happens in the brain during the attentional blink if the brain is fed another image or another piece of information. So what we do then is we show you an image. Visual targets or visual masks are used again, and we have a stimulus onset asynchrony here, SOA, from 200 to 500 milliseconds. So that allows then for attentional blink and a more physiological time to process information. And the prediction is that something like this should happen. There should be a sudden nonlinear curve that allows for global ignition of the global workspace, a nonlinear phenomenon. And here is the setup. So we want to find the number 5 at T2. And we want to find OXXO at T1, and we have other stimuli in the middle, and we can vary the time period in between. And so here's what we see. The prediction, in fact, is borne out. Unseen and seen stimuli have different dynamics. For example, in the anterior cingulate, this is the unseen event, this is the seen event or conscious event. It also is true in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, in the medial temporal cortex, and in the anterior cingulate here as well, conscious, non-conscious. So this then indicates that during the attentional blink, information will not be processed broadly into frontal regions to the extent that a perceived stimulus is. And that, of course, is borne out by the behavioral observation that subjects don't perceive the item during the attentional blink period, which in fact correlates with the waveforms that we see here, which tend to corroborate the global workspace ignition model. So let me show you a movie here. So this shows you the sequence of events that you see when attentional blink occurs. You see in the scene in the middle panel here how the yellow color is migrating throughout the cortex in a rather sudden, explosive way. This is the paper DeHane's lab in Neuroscience 2005, Nature Neuroscience, which was one of the major papers here. And here's another replay of this. There's some more here, so let's watch a little longer. And so you can see here that's Dr. DeHane, of course, explaining this work. Let's have it go through maybe. So here again you see the visual cortex V1 igniting, temporal cortex is coming online, and the signal is then broadcast to the frontal cortex in a rather explosive fashion. So this is kind of a visual presentation of the data. Okay, so that was the state of the art. It is the state of the art for many labs. But here is a new wrinkle. This is the paper that just appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences from a group in Amsterdam, I believe. And again, here are two interesting features utilized to probe two aspects of consciousness, namely perceptual integration with and without conscious access. The technology used is a very interesting type of stimulus, namely the so-called Canizas stimulus, or a Canizas triangle. I will show you these in just a minute. The other aspect is, again, the employment of attentional blink and machine learning and artificial intelligence to interrogate the time series produced by the EEG to find classifiers that will allow you to determine whether, number one, a conscious percept has been integrated in the brain, and number two, whether this integrated visual percept has been perceived in consciousness. All right, so here's the abstract of the paper, and it talks about the idea of perceptual integration and using the manipulated axis for consciousness in the attentional blink. So the attentional blink impairs conscious decisions about the presence of integrated surface structures from fragmented input. These are the triangles I will show you in a minute. However, despite conscious access being impaired, the ability to decode the presence of integrated percepts remains intact, as showed through multivariate classification analysis of EEG data. So let me show you the funny stimuli that are being used. Now, this is a triangle that is not really there. See? This triangle, it's a visual illusion, but it stands out in your mind. You can see a triangle that your brain infers from the rest of the visual stimulus. And in fact, the triangle seems to have increased brightness when compared to the surrounding areas. So here would be a control stimulus where this event does not take place. Here's another example. Here all the lines are connected, and here is the inference that your brain makes that there should be a pentagram in the center of this image. Here's yet another one. And in each case, this percept needs to be integrated. So it needs to be extracted by the brain from the other features that are present in the visual stimulus. There is an extraction and a composition aspect to this, because the percept is not real. It doesn't exist. It is made inside your brain. It looks totally real to you, but of course it's not. You can tell that you infer the presence of these structures because of the surrounding aspects of the stimulus being so suggestive that your brain says, okay, I see a triangle or I see a pentagram here. Okay, so here are some control masks. We talked about visual masking. This is also employed here. That kind of look similar, have similar brightness and features of the real stimulus, but are sufficiently different. So what this experiment then does is determine two things. Number one, does the brain extract the virtual Canisa figure from the stimulus? And number two, does the subject consciously perceive this stimulus? So here's the setup. We again have the presentation of the stimulus and different time frame, T1 and T2. And we have our target here, 3 targets, and here are 3 controls, which look very similar, but do not produce this particular optical illusion or this particular visual construction in the brain. So here we go. We have a stimulus. We have variable intervals here, so-called jitters, and then we have the target that we see here. So subjects were required to press a button whenever any black target would repeat, regardless of whether this target contains the Canisa or not, while ignoring the red distractors. So this is then a task that allows to train the artificial intelligence classifier using a signal that is not contaminated by response mechanisms, decision mechanisms, and or the percept of the control or the Canisa type percept. So we expose the machine learning computer to a whole bunch of these trials while the EEG is being recorded, and the machine learning algorithm can then determine what are the critical features that can be extracted, the classifiers that differentiate the integration of this structure and the conscious perception of this structure. And as it turns out, the classifier becomes very, very accurate. So between 0.7 and 1.0, 1.0 of course is 100%, classification, there is a correlation of 0.61 and a p beta of 0.003, highly significant correlation. And you can see these types of structures here, the blue ones, cluster here at the higher efficiency of behavioral accuracy. So this is a classification done automatically by the neural net that extracts these classifiers in a learning paradigm. Okay, so here we have a light blue one which corresponds to this one here, and so on and so forth. Now, we need, of course, to differentiate between what is the behavior that is reported and what is the classification. So here we have a mask event. So if you mask the presentation of the Canisa stimulus with another nonsensical stimulus, there is no learning, there's no perception, there's no visual integration of the Canisa stimulus. It gets wiped out if presented with a subsequent unrelated stimulus, and no classification occurs in the computer program. However, in the unmasked condition, where there is no disruptive stimulus presented after the kinesia stimulus, the algorithm learns how to predict here that a percept has been laid down in neuronal structures. So the behavior, the response accuracy is also indicated here. If you have the mass condition, the subject will not report that he or she has seen this particular visual construct, the kinesia triangle or octogram or pentagram, but in the unmasked condition it is perceived even after a relatively short lag. However, there should be a decrease. Remember the attentional blink. So this model then seems to be robust. It tends to indicate that in the masked condition, number one, there is no conscious percept. And number two, the EEG classifier is flat. It does not detect any percept being laid down in the brain. How about contrast? You have noticed that some of these triangles or pentagrams look much more vivid than others. We need to control for that, and that was done in this experiment. And you can see that contrast feature extraction here is different from the perceptual integration signal here. And this, of course, is true here as well. In the EEG, finally, you can see there is a terrific difference between contrast and the detection of the integrated percept. So, this shows then that the brain is able to integrate features into perceptual objects when conscious access is in fact not taking place. Dynamic feature grouping that underlies perceptual integration is thought to rely on cortical feedback loops. So this is the Bayesian idea that there is a backpropagation from priors into the incoming signal, and that this crosstalk between the feed-forward sweep and the prior comparison leading to error extraction is a critical event in consciousness production. So this then belongs into this classification here that is from Dehaney. We have a preconscious state. So the percept is extracted, perhaps, the theory would say, of the triangles and the pentagrams. However, consciousness has not been reached. So here are the references that substantiate all of this. These are clickable, and many more that you can consult if you are a subscriber to this enhanced content. So what have we learned today? We have learned that we can manipulate access consciousness by employing the technology of the attentional blink. We can sneak in percepts into the brain that are at the threshold of conscious perception, but may or may not reach conscious perception. And it appears that conscious perception is linked to a sudden ignition of vast neuronal assemblies that can put this stimulus into a larger context and produce consciousness. Or perhaps in the latest paper here, what may be required is backpropagation and a crosstalk between the forward sweep, the avalanche of information coming in from the senses, and a crosstalk with prior information that leads to the error detection in the Bayesian brain model. Okay, so this concludes this lecture, the third lecture on consciousness. The next one will deal with a different approach, namely the integrated information theory by Giulio Tononi, recently adopted by Koch as well. And this integration then promises a theory of everything, really, of consciousness. It's also based on some rigorous mathematics that would allow us to put consciousness firmly into the realm of physics, where models in the end have to be expressed in equations, and the equations have to lead to predictions that can be experimentally tested. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll see you soon for yet another lecture, number 4, on consciousness.